Cunas Tea, this is Sorcha jumping in quickly with a couple of quick announcements. We are running our very first retreat in collaboration with House of Legends and some other wonderful storytellers and musicians and creative people. This is going to be running from the 10th to the 13th of August 2023 in the wilds of High Hild Alban, today known as Scotland. There are very few places still left available, so you can follow the link in the show notes to grab yourself a spot. We have a live show coming up in Whelan's, Dublin on Sunday the 20th of August. You can find tickets on our website through the link in the show notes. And if you are listening to this in the future after that date, you can still follow that link to find out what shows are currently coming up. Hope to see you there. And now, back to the regular podcast. Cunas, how are ye? Welcome back to the Candlelit Tales podcast, where we are chatting about stories. Again, you can support us if you want to at patreon.com/Candlelit Tales, but you don't have to. You can like and you can comment and you can subscribe as well, which are also very helpful, and share these with friends. And we are back in the studio with a very special guest. I'm here with my brother Aron, as always.
And we're very excited to be continuing our discussion about storytelling, Irish mythology, folklore, and everything in between with the author of the Táin, Alan Titley from Cork. And we got to get that in there. Last episode, we talked about all the backgrounds of the oral tradition and Alan's amazing background in stories as well. And we're going to focus in on the fact that you've written a version of the Táin, Alan, and it's interesting that you've done this because, well, what I find it interesting, we started telling the Táin as the first story. We tried to conquer, if there's ever such a thing as that, with this immense, massive story that it is, and getting it down to a small, light book of a mere 4 pages is quite a task, considering the amount that is in it and how many stories and how many kind of tangents it goes on. Alan, can you tell us a little bit about how you managed to condense this book into the way you did it?
Okay, now the first thing is I'm going to correct you if I can. I'm
Please,
not the author of this. I'm
simply
sorry. I am the reteller of it. Yeah. One of hundreds of retellers of the Táin over 1,000 or maybe 2,000 years, who knows. So I'm coming at the end, but hopefully not the very end of a line of tellers of the story.
Good correction.
The big thing was, I said, yes, as I was saying in a previous podcast, I knew the story from both being in school, from hearing it told, from the stories about Cuchulainn, from having studied the original Old Irish version and having read the other ones along the way. And then when I was asked to do this, and I kind of hesitated first, it's nice to be asked to do something nonetheless, you know, it's kind of, and it's unusual for an author to be asked to do something. So I kind of said, well, I'm privileged to be part of this long tradition in a different sense, because I jokingly say very often, you know, Ireland, sometimes we don't think we're very good. We're not very proud of many things, apart from having won the Eurovision Song Contest more than anybody else. But we'll skip that one. We do have the longest unbroken vernacular literature in Western Europe.
Wow.
And there is something hugely important about it. We have a fantastic literature, and the Táin is one of those that's coming at the very beginning, or as close to the beginning as you can possibly tell. So in that sense, you know, if we can tell a story that is probably set around the time of Christ, you know, which is 2,000 years old, and it is possible that the original version, whoever did it, wherever it was done, whoever that person was, it is possible that that was done around that time. Although, of course, it is common for stories to be pitched in the past tense anyway, and it's always kind of easier to tell the story in the past tense. But it may, whenever it was told, it wasn't that far back. It was kind of in you know, you could almost reach out and touch it, even if it was a couple of 100 years. So how did I manage to do it? I read the versions and reread the versions, so I had a good idea of what it was. I made a rough sketch on a piece of paper, like smallish piece of paper, of what the main events were, because it was important to get the guts, the bones, the spine of the story.
Like how you describe that is like when you're telling it to younger people, you need to know yourself the very through line, the arc or the spine of the story.
That's what it was. And of course, in the original, and of course when we say the original, there isn't an original. Anyway, in one of the ones that may be perhaps deemed perhaps to be an early version, perhaps maybe in caveat, related in some way to the
God.
original version. Okay,
Tie yourselves up.
if we're going to take
Knots here, then.
one of those ones, there are a whole load of extraneous bits and add-on bits and bits that are chopped off and bits that are hanging off it and so on. And therefore, whoever was putting it together, and storytellers in Irish traditions we know were free to do what they liked. Up to a point.
Yeah.
If you were telling the story, you could tell an entirely different version of the Táin, Maybe Alil instead of Maeve might be the one to instigate a row about two cows, although the bulls are, I suppose, fairly important along the way.
I think you gotta have the bulls.
We need the bulls. All right. So the bulls were important, Alil and Maeve were important, Cuchulainn was important, and I suppose the great battle between himself and Ferdia, and then the very end, they were all important. And maybe the row when the men of Connacht go to Ulster and claim that they only want to borrow the bull, but they'd have taken the bull anyway.
Yeah.
And they're the main bits of it. So once you write that down, so on the one hand, I kind of would make a sketch or made a sketch of who they were and then maybe the characters as well. And I suppose the only time I really had to kind of go back over things were when there were some difficult bits, and I'd kind of read bits as well, like when Cuchulainn does his war spasm, which we'll come to in a few minutes. That would be one. And also people's names, because, the names, and they come in different shapes and come in different forms, in the different versions as well.
Yeah.
So are you going to use the Old Irish version? Are you going to use the Modern Irish version? Are you going to use some version in between? I mean, Maeve, for example, in Old Irish is spelled M-E-D-B. And the more modern version, M-E-D-B-H, which is even more complicated. Now, if you're going to put M-E-D-B-H into a novel or into a story for foreign readers, they have enough difficulties. Yeah, Medivh. The one who intoxicates by mead.
Yeah.
That's what it means.
By mead.
By mead. It's
Okay.
associated with the word mead. At least that's what they say.
That's
I knew the intoxicating.
I knew she was the one who intoxicates.
Because mead was one of the only few alcoholic drinks that they had. I mean, whiskey only came in the 15th century, and wine would only have been imported most of the time. And beer they would have made all right, but mead was the one because bees were very important.
Yeah,
so, see, we're going off on a tangent about Maeve already. You see,
Don't you worry about that. No, don't you worry about that. We're focusing on
Maeve is important.
When we say we're going to focus.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, so the difficulty and there's the 10-minute Táin in terms of our experience of telling.
Yeah. We have told it in 10 minutes.
Okay.
If you have to.
No, that's a fast
So
story.
there weren't too many people killed in your version of the
There were a
Táin,
lot,
there
but none of them were named.
You don't name. You leave the names out of that one.
All right, okay.
There's the hour-long version, which is a live retelling, which is one again, and there's the one you tell over 5 nights or
Well, this was
5 months.
our inaugural Candlelit Tales experience. I was telling you about where we had 5 nights between 5 weeks between when we decided to start and Christmas season, and we told a part of the Táin every night for those 5 nights, and that was where this started as Candlelit Tales started, and then there's also, I mean, we have come back to it a few times on the podcast, and during lockdown took our time with doing a much more involved version of it. We've
Come
come
back to Lady Gregory versions.
Lady Gregory version. We've gone back to the Kinsella version. We've also we've taken kind of slants at it where we've just taken different characters and they're moments of the battle rage coming on them in different ways. We've kind of played with this a lot.
Because there's a lot of, there seems to be a lot of license to do that. Even just expanding the boys troop was one of the
That was one of the shows that we did. That was one of the more traumatizing shows.
One of the more traumatizing
shows.
shows.
Made a show around the boys troop.
That time right after Cuchulainn has fought Ferdia, and suddenly you have this kind of heroic but devastatingly tragic filling in between the gaps of Conor McGart's.
Did you kill a dog? Which you didn't play? Which you played hurling?
Killed plenty dogs. Kill a lot of dogs in Irish mythology.
Along the way,
Kill a lot of dogs and a lot of children.
Poor old Cullen and the big old beast along the way. Yeah, but anyway, the dogs, I like dogs. We have a dog. My daughter's a dog. We don't like to talk about the death of dogs without killing dogs too often.
We met a beautiful wolf in China the other day.
We did meet a beautiful wolf. But they're scary. They're big.
But what you're saying, though, really is that, of course, it's a story that is giving endlessly.
Yes.
You can do all kinds of things, which obviously the storytellers did over the centuries. That they were adding in. And I remember a great quote by the English author Somerset Maugham, and he was talking about writing stories. I think it's true of telling stories as well, where he said, if you're a writer, You can tell a story for a magazine in 3,000 words, and the same story you can tell it in 10,000 words when you're putting it into a book.
Yeah.
If you're a writer, that's what you do. And a bit like the guy I was referring to in the last podcast, the Yugoslavian or Serbian storyteller that, give me 4 words and I will tell a story. Story, that's what they do, and you expand it. And if you were ever, I remember, the old cliche about Oscar Wilde about labouring all morning, putting in a comment all afternoon, because that's rubbish. That's not what you do. If you write, and I've written plays for radio, and you have 27 minutes. So the producer will say to you, get rid of that. You have to cut 5 minutes out of it. You have to cut 7 minutes out of it. And you have to do it, and it has to work. So I was given it, this was a young person's version of the Táin. Therefore, I had to imagine that was only going to be 170, 180 pages long. I mean, it was, you could add it a bit more, but this is the kind of length of the book that for the odds with. And then once I had worked out what the main people were and what the main events were, it was a matter of writing it. And then it's a matter of kind of getting the style, which is always a difficult one.
I guess that was my next point. I mean, like the whatever about cutting out the extraneous characters, and because there's so many there. That's really the
there's
weeding.
a lot of trimming and a lot of reading to do.
And then you have to choose your angle. Which you started with Queen Maeve, and starting with that angle and kind of keeping that perspective, which is a very kind of tactful one, really, because you get to kind of tell the story from that point of view with everything else happening and the bull raid. And then there's the style, and I suppose
I think there's an interesting thing as well of the voice, because I find when writing, sometimes you have a different voice for a different project. Like sometimes the voice that you have in one play is a different voice than you have in a different play, depending on there's a kind of a little bit of shape-shifting involved when you're writing. You come up with a different style for different things.
You have to. I mean, if you set out to write a funny story, which I've done occasionally, you kind of get into a funny mood. If you want to write,
couldn't imagine it.
If you get into a cross one or a kind of an angry one, you're kind of using different words deliberately. So one of the problems with the Táin is that it has a whole lot of different styles.
Yeah.
And I think it is a whole lot of different styles because different people were adding their own goblet to it as they were going along. But the style is, for example, a lot of the speech is clipped. It's like a detective novel. It's kind of two people asking questions and giving answers. It's like a play. It's going, and then you come to a piece that is descriptive, and then you come to another sort of one where it's kind of an internal monologue, or somebody's telling you what's going on. So all these styles are there, and you kind of have to get them in, but not make them so, on the one hand, so strange and exotic that you lose a reader. On the other hand, you want to keep some of that exoticness there to attract them. And I was very conscious that there's a thing about children's literature that you shouldn't use what Paddy Crosby of the School Around the Corner fame, this gives my age away. This was a radio program where what he used to call the hard words, when he'd ask the kids. It was a lovely program where kids were just interviewed, and he had a lovely way with them. And one of them, and they were fun bits, and he'd get them to tell a funny story. Right. And some of them were really funny, and some of them it was a live program. Some of them they had to cut out when there was a repeat, and I won't repeat what some of those were. But one of them was, what's a hard. Today's hard words, he was a dub himself, and he would give a hard word like pallias. What is a pallias? Hoping, it's a kind of mattress, but somebody would say a friendly donkey. You see, they get a bit and kids loved it. What's a blunderbuss? And kids would, and they mightn't know what it is, but they would come up with something along the way.
It's inviting,
and kids, I think, especially readers, they like words, and they like made-up words, and they like funny names of people. And I mean, whether you're telling a story or writing a story. So I was conscious not to dumb it down to the extent that it would be at the level of a Daily Mail reader. It would be something a little bit more complicated, because there are bits that are difficult, and you have to make sure that a reader, and I think readers like playing around with it, and will take that once you keep the story going.
Well, you don't want to spoon feed. Like you don't need to. Like you don't. I think people often mistake like children's theatre for the fact that it's overly simplistic and you're literally giving all the information. You're not expecting them to jump into that kind of that almost narrative kind of role that you take on yourself when you're putting the story together and you're asking questions.
You're not
solving
expecting
problems.
it to be an active reader.
Yeah.
You're expecting a certain passivity from kids a lot of the time, and I think it's often unfair. I think
it's unfair. Okay.
Underestimate the
we
audience.
underestimate them,
Especially kids who are readers. That's
Oh,
the
yeah.
thing. And kids who are readers are special because people keep saying they're a minority within a minority, and maybe they are, but I don't believe necessarily so. And one of the other interesting things is, and again going off on a tangent, go into a bookshop and you will find on a Saturday morning you will find a kids section full of parents buying books for their kids, and the kids are there, but you won't find the parents buying the books for themselves very often.
Yeah.
You know? So, but that's a cynical take on it. But anyway, that's what I did, and that's how I wrote it, and that's how it came out. So
Well,
I'm not sure.
The language is quite in the dialogue anyway. Bits is quite modern. Like it's not you're not you don't go into the seven-folded cloak, with the cloak.
With the brooch at the throat, we're not getting into mine
flowery,
husband, and it doesn't sound like a translation. It sounds
I mean, the thing about, I suppose, the 19th century novel, which we often think is a kind of a touchstone of certain kinds of writing, they had to describe things in minute detail because you didn't have film, you didn't have cameras.
Yeah.
Whereas now, reading a novel, a lot of that stuff is gone. Because unless the writer deliberately sets out to write luscious language, which is fair, you can do that if you want to. But in this case, there's enough action in it for the story to keep it going.
Yes.
And it's one after the other. The problem was that so much of it is repetitious. There's a chunk in the middle of the time where Cuchulainn is battling these warriors and they're going to be killed. Mm-hmm. And geez, I was feeling sorry for them along there. There was another one, and they all thought we're going to get him today along the way.
Get him.
But it was only the scheming and the plotting by Maeve and Alan. We'll bribe this one and we'll give them our daughter. You have to be careful about this. I think she was offered. She was offered several times.
She was offered several times. She did not like it.
Yeah. Now that would be another angle. What about her story?
Yeah.
What would she think about it? People didn't think of that. But so there are all those other angles.
Did we do an episode?
Oisín told a Finiver story. It was fantastic.
Did he? Yeah.
He's got a very Dublin accent and he's got a very deep voice, and he took on the character of Finiver, and it was great.
Okay.
Because what the story is that she walks into Onigat, she goes to Morrigan, and she disappears when she finds out how often she's been promised by her mother. Her revenge is to take herself out of the equation and go you hang on all your broken promises there, ma'am.
But because Maeve is not a very nice person.
I love that.
She's not a very good
I love
mother.
that about
She's not
Maeve.
a very good mother, and I mean
She's a terrible mother.
And Kinsella villainizes her quite easily, I think, in his version. Like, I think she becomes the villain of his story a bit too easily, because it's like, evil Maeve when she come in fighting. And but again, it's this not black, not white, not good, not bad, somewhere in the middle that all these characters kind of can be. And Maeve is extremely powerful and strong and ambitious, and not necessarily altogether evil, but she's not a great mother. That's for sure.
But Alan seems to be a bit of a prick. I mean,
he's a bit of a prick.
And but also he's weaker than her.
Yes.
I mean, even though he's rouses the army and looking after the army, you get the impression she's making the decisions all the time.
Yeah.
Well, there is that thing of he's got a bit of a Napoleon syndrome going on, where he knows he knows he's not the one who's in charge here, and he's trying to assert himself all the time.
But he does have a bull.
He does have a bull.
Because she gave it to him.
She gave it to him, which is an interesting
Yeah,
metaphor.
it's an interesting one. Well, you see, there's the other one.
Here's my masculinity. You gave it to me.
You get it.
Oh, shit.
Well, you see, if you wanted to do all kinds of deep Freudian crap,
You could,
you could dig a lot in that.
absolutely.
And that may be there. I've little enough time for that kind of psychology myself, but that's
That's
beside
someone else's job. That's
that is somebody else's job. I'm not sure how much of it is true. Anyway, but it's interesting in that Maeve, as a queen, has the same status as Alan, because in Old Irish law, and there's a lot of interesting things in Old Irish law, when people got married, this is anybody got married, they brought their riches, such as they were, with them, and they maintained them. In other words, the wife didn't give them over to the husband, that the way that happened much later.
Yeah.
Therefore, that beginning of it is a reflection of the old Brehon laws, because both of them owned the stuff that they brought to the marriage, no matter what it was. And there were a whole lot of laws which, early Catholic Ireland would not have supported. For example, you had divorce. You had, which was maybe reasonably easy, but there were all kinds of punishments, and a woman could divorce a man for all kinds of reasons. One of them was if he was too fat to do the deed, so to speak, along the way. Another one was if he could hit her, but not if she left a blemish. So you had to be very careful. You had to be very careful.
He could hit her, but he couldn't mark her.
He could mark her, yeah. So and then there were all kinds of other sort of things that when you divorced, you took the stuff that you'd brought to the marriage, you could take that away with you as well. So, there were a lot of things that were quite... So in that sense, there is a society being shown here which at least reflects, to some extent, what we know of the society that was there. We can't say it's exact and it's precise because, again, there's a big debate about the Brehon laws, how many of them were really pre-Christian, how many of them borrowed stuff from Latin, and there's a big debate over that as well. And I've no doubt that they borrowed some of them there, but a lot of them did stay with what was the rule behind that. But women, powerful women, were powerful, but there weren't that many of them there.
Yeah.
But then you have your Deirdre, and you have others. I mean, Deirdre's very powerful in the Finn stories, the Finn cycle as well, But that's more as a temptress.
Yeah.
But even she is very kind of dominant when she takes over with Diarmuid, and also she kind of has the and Groine, and they have the hex on Finn McCool as well.
So there's definitely powerful women. My question about Maeve always is she one of the godlike people in the background of these stories as she kind of comes up in versions of Angus Og?
I certainly have a book that asserts that she is she's based on a historical, that there was a historical Queen Maeve in Connacht whose father was one of the continental Celts who was educated in Rome and then went out and stirred up rebellions. But again, this is going into history and prehistory and semi-written things. And
I am very dubious about anybody talking about prehistory. I mean, I think it's great speculation.
It's great speculation.
Prehistory, like it's before we started history.
It's extremely interesting speculation.
I'm even more dubious about anything to do with the Celts, but that's a separate...
Yeah.
Even though, yes, there were Celtic languages, yes, there were people that the Greeks called Celts. We actually know very little about them. The Druids are very little about them.
The Romans did a great job of pointing that out.
It doesn't stop us speculating, and we can. And it may well be true, and there may well have been a Queen of Connacht called Maeve, and there may not. But in some way, it doesn't matter. More than likely, yes, she comes from some kind of a goddess background, as a lot of them did, as they did in Greek mythology as well, as a lot of the others, as the Morrigan does, The Mór Riagan, the big queen. That's what a Morrigan is. It sounds like the Mór Rian. The big queen. Mórian.
I've heard, because it's either Mórian or it's Máirtín, and one is shadow and one is large.
Yeah.
So
that's what linguists have great fun with.
Go.
And they've great fun over this. They fight wars, in corridors of academia over this kind of stuff. They don't talk to one another. They don't talk to one another.
This is where with storytellers you're like, the day that I want her to be big, she's the Mórian.
And
the day that I want her to be shadowy, she's the Máirtín.
That's it.
That might be the same story too.
It might be the same
what
story.
is it? Never let the truth get in the way of a good story, especially when the truth is hotly debated in the corridors of
But
academia.
the other big thing about it is that the very end of it, and again, there's not much of it in this version, but that when the bulls fight, which is again interesting, and the Ulster Bull wins. And, although it's more County Louth really, not quite.
There were different borders.
Along the way. And when he struggles back home on his way, and he's dropping his guts, and his guts are falling on the land around the place, and of course the names of places were very important. And Athlone, Ohaluin means the loins of the ford of the loins. The ford. Yes. So he drops them there.
Loins,
that's where the loins. The bull. He drops his guts in that loin, basically, and that's where they're probably walking across his guts to cross the river for many years. And a whole lot of places are explained because of that. And again,
that old Táin Trail is literally littered with that.
It is. And in fact, one of the things they should do. I mean, I was listening recently where there's opening a Yeats Trail, which is fine and it's great for Yeats and Yeats people. But and Yeats used mythology as well. Sometimes good, sometimes
No,
bad.
no,
So
that's
suspiciously.
Yeah.
We won't go there.
We leave them
We've
off.
got friends from Sligo listening to this. We won't go in there.
He's all
But
right, he's all right.
you could well make a big tourist thing out of the Táin as well.
You could.
Between Cruachan, which is underdeveloped, where
Yeah,
and
I mean,
It has a cult following, and like every year we get
Well,
invited
we-
back to the Táin Trail from people from
The
Louth
Táin March,
and Drogheda,
yeah,
and
yeah.
they do the Táin March.
They
and
will
they
get
try and
together
reenact it and do
it's
bits and
more
pieces.
about local communities, but I
It
think it
is,
has
yeah.
it has great potential to grow.
It has, yeah.
If one were to highlight it.
It's just that kind of like tapping into the popularity of this story and the fact that maybe, for a long time, it's the Irish Iliad in a lot of ways. It's the one that people kind of know a bit about. It's not necessarily the one everyone knows a lot of. But if you go digging it at all, you'll come to the Táin, and people will kind of will have a background knowledge as soon as they dip their toe in. And it's the first one you kind of come to. It's the first one I certainly came to.
It's the first
anyway.
one we came to.
And you obviously could. I mean, there are other great tales. I love the tale of Sweeney, the Mad Sweeney, who was the King Wood Mad. It's a great one. And Seamus Heaney, the Red Version, that's again another old Irish story. And that's telling you about somebody opposing the power of the church, but also it's got to do with the artist being separate from the community. There's all kinds of things going on there. But when you're mentioning the Louth connection and the Táin Trail, I mean, GA have the Puck Fada, which is held in the Cooley Mountains. Now, I have an idea that what you could have is a competition for killing dogs with a slitter. You line up these dogs.
Line up the targets.
And you get a prize for the one who kills the most dogs. I mean, there's nothing wrong. Now, I'm patenting that idea. Just makes sense.
I mean, I think you can keep it. If you see the wolfhounds, you're not going to be able to kill them with a slitter. Okay, so I would love to hear a little bit of this book, if you wouldn't mind reading. It's a couple of sections out, and this is the beautiful book that is illustrated by Owen Coveney, another Cork man. Just get that in there.
Yes, indeed, I know Owen Coveney, I should say. Yeah, he's another Cork man. I never met him, but we were in contact by email, and he would ask me about elements because he was trying to make the illustrations, which are brilliant, as close to the time as possible, even though I was saying, look, it doesn't have to be, it's mythology anyway, but I think he did a wonderful job of it. I'll tell you what, I'll read the very beginning.
Yeah, lovely.
First, and then maybe one small bit afterwards. This is the beginning, the row where Alan and Maeve are in bed. It's probably a bed of rushes or somewhere, or lying down on a kind of a pallet or something. It wouldn't have been that. And Maeve is the first person to speak, so you have to imagine Maeve and then Alan, then Maeve and Alan. So Maeve says, "Say that again." "I said what I said." "I dare you say that again," she said. "Forget about it," he said. "No way," she said. "You went on a bit about me being lucky to be married to you. And that's true. You're a lucky woman to be married to me." She sat up in her rugs. Anger came out of her nostrils. He wasn't going to get away with this. No way. "I was a rich woman before I got hooked up with you. The kings of Ireland had their tongues hanging out, wanting to marry me. Then you came along, not bad looking, plenty of stuff to be on with. Said nice things, did the deal, and we got married." Inwardly, Maeve was raging. She was Queen of Connacht, Alan was her husband, also happened to be king. Sometimes that did not seem to be too important, like now. He had insulted her, big time. He had insinuated that he was richer than her. Kings and queens were equal, that was it. So that's the start. So it gets worse after that. Along the way.
First of all, I think you're going to have to do the audiobook for me, just for me, to read it all out. But I love, and I'm very, I love the fact that you're straight into the story. There's no kind of building or background or stage setting. It's just, you're straight into the conversation. I think that's just kind of very imaginative. It's very, you're already into a page turner, and you don't need to know anything about mythology to read this book.
Yeah, and of course that's not the beginning in every version.
Of course,
no.
You want to get that
one. And I mean, the other one that's not in there about Cuchulainn and the dogs that we were talking about, and the hounds. That's a kind of a pre-story, but it's still kind of included as the main bit of it.
So that was. So I've two main questions before we read the last bit. Okay, so if you can answer me this one question, anyway, I might have a second one. But before we read the end of it, can you tell me, in your best, most efficient way, what is the Táin about? Because I've asked you a number of times, and it's hard to pinpoint. And I have my own theory on this. And, you know, it's a kind of a theoretical question, but like...
Well, it's a choice.
Yeah, it's a choice. So what, for you, in terms of, you know, going through it and writing it and rewriting it and all the rest of it, if you had to summarise, what the hell is that about?
Frank O'Connor, great Cork writer, said once upon a time it was a long, rambling story about two bulls. I'm not inclined to agree with him about that.
Okay.
I think it is about the big things. It's about jealousy, love, war, heroism, treachery, loyalty, and all those basic things which we live and suffer and endure in all of our lives. But it is done in a different way, seemingly about warfare. It's also about warfare, and seemingly about courage, and it's about that as well, and it's about cowardice. So if you take all those big words, but important words and common words, that's what it's about.
Gorgeous.
Lovely.
Thank you for that. I have to, kind of jump in and kind of, or even, because for me, the heightened emotional state of the whole thing comes in around the point of Ferdy and Cuchulainn, and it seems it always, when we're telling it live, that's the biggest thing that everyone cares about.
That's kind of the heart of it.
Band brothers, and again, it has all that human emotion, that connection, that tragedy, that loss, and ultimately, you know, what is it all good for? Because so many people die, and it's a kind of an anti-war.
Yeah,
story,
we've often said this is the war.
Yeah,
but
there's actually
good God, y'all! What is it good
I was
for?
actually asked by the publishers. Well, you know, it ends very suddenly, and it does in its own way. Put in a little bit towards the end of Cuchulainn's reflections. So there's a little bit at the end, basically, when he was asking, "What is this all about?" So you know, I can't answer for Cuchulainn, but you know, it was a question of, well, all my friends are killed. You know, they're all gone. That's it. And why did I have to do this?
Beautiful.
And at the same time, I may have to do it again because I'm a warrior.
And that's
and
the
these
beautiful,
things don't last.
Yeah, that's the beautiful thing of actually going into the head of these characters, where you only get the external actions. You get to sometimes actually imagine what's going on in their minds. The other question I had with you was how you managed to deal with the príomhscéaltar, the background stories, and putting them in without bombarding people with, oh yeah, this happened before, and this happened before, and this happened before. Did you find that a bit difficult?
I did find that difficult, but again, I think I used the same principle, if it is a principle. In other words, what would be important to illustrate the story?
Yes.
And you have to use the dog and the slitter, because Cuchulainn has his hurley along the way anyway, and that's how he got his name. So that's part of it as well. And that was the main one, I think, along the way. And some of the other ones about the debilitation of the Ulstermen, well, that kind of had to be put in because it explained why they were all kind of knocked out.
Yeah.
Apart from that, the other ones were not that important. So I think that was it. And I presume that they were not in whatever the first telling of the story was. I presume that somebody came along and said, well, hang on a minute, how come all these people are kind of debilitated? What is wrong with them? So how come
first?
You got to explain it.
Yeah.
You got to go back and explain it. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's what it was.
Absolutely.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, listen, I'd love to hear this next piece, because it's always something.
This is Cuchulainn, and again we were talking about the hero, and he is the hero who, before he goes into battle, seems to. It sounds like people before a hurling match or a football match, where they're kind of riled up in the dressing room by some mad. Manager
by the store going mental.
I was about to mention somebody, but I decided I wouldn't. And we're going to bang in the table and breaking the hurley and dropping teas on the floor. And it's a bit like that. And riling people up. And that does happen.
Fitz no jumps to mind, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, funny, I think I thought of him as well. But
I think that was in the ether.
He won't sue you.
He won't.
So I think we have to imagine Cuchulainn like that, but of course it's much exaggerated because he is Cuchulainn and he has to go into this, and it's a wonderful piece of invention. What happened? I mean, when you read any of the originals or the genuine translations as a piece of writing, it's fantastic. You know, and the grotesquerie of it, and this is the grotesquerie, which is like so much that is normal enough. Like the battles, and some of it is normal enough. Like Maeve and Alan, that's normal enough. And this is mad stuff. This is
Cuchulainn's
so this is Cuchulainn's warp spasm. Then he put on his magic cloak, which made him invisible. It was a gift given to him by his father from the other world. He was nearly ready. But first, the battle rage came over him. He changed appearance like a monster possessed. First of all, every slice and sliver of him began to quiver and to shake. The skin of his body turned inside out. His feet and his shins twisted around and pointed backwards. His heels and his calves faced to the front. The veins in his neck looked like ropes that swelled up full of venom. His face became like a boiling pot of fiery liquid. One eye got sucked deep into his head. The other dangled down upon his cheek. His cheeks flaked back so you could see his guts flapping in his gullet. His palates clattered like stones hammering one another. Bubbles of white spit steamed in his mouth. His heart whanged against his ribs. His hair rose up in wiry spikes as sharp as spears, and a spout of dark blood geysered up from the top of his head, making a mist above him, while he urged his charioteer to get ready for the assault. And after that, he's ready, and he goes into battle and kills a whole lot of them. So,
terrifies. And that's right after the boys' troop, is it?
That's I think it is just before he goes in to attack them. Yeah. So,
and there's that beautiful description of the women see him up on top of the hill and they can't believe.
There's a nice little bit about the women looking at him and seeing this beautiful youth and then looking at the monster in the chariot and going, that can't be the same person.
Can't be the same. Yes. Who was the green guy who used to change to
the Hulk? I always
the
Hulk is just
Hulk was, I was talking to kids recently, sixth class or fifth class, and I mentioned the Incredible Hulk. It meant nothing.
Yeah.
Really? See, these things, time changes. You think
wild.
what we remember, but that's it.
Well, listen, Alan, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast.
I really enjoyed having a great chat.
I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed. If you haven't listened to our last podcast, listen to the last one to hear lots more of Alan's thoughts on mythology, folklore, stories, and life lessons.
More of this conversation.
This book is in shops somewhere, Little Island
we
books.
are going to find out exactly where it is easiest for you to purchase it, and we are going to put a link in the show notes.
Yes, that's what we'll do.
So that
the Táin, the Great Irish Epic, written by Alan Titley and illustrated by Owen Coveney, and it'll be in books. And I highly recommend everyone go and get it.
Go and get it. Well, go out and get it. I think it's if. People often ask us what's a good starting point as well. So I wouldn't necessarily say, only get that for younger people. I think if you are interested in a starting point for Irish myth, I think that you could do a lot. You could do a lot worse. I think it'll be a very nice place to start.
I happen to agree with you.
Shocking. Thanks a million for coming on.
You're more than welcome. I really enjoyed it.
Brilliant.